Well, good evening, friends. I welcome you to the journey and to our next episode of Expert Opinion. I'm so excited for our conversation tonight. And for those who are interested, we are almost at the end of season 1 of Expert Opinion. And so tonight, having a conversation with my new friend Amanda. And the next 2 weeks, we'll have a conversation with the Harrisburg District Superintendent, School District Superintendent, as well as Messiah University's president. And so glad to have been involved in these conversation series over the last couple of months. And thanks for tuning in faithfully each week. And so tonight, I'm so excited for our conversation. And I'm going to bring my friend Amanda up on the screen. Amanda serves as the executive director of the Central Pennsylvania LGBTQ Center. Did I get that right, Amanda?
The LGBT Center of Central PA. But yes,
well, feel free just to share with us a little bit about who you are, Amanda, and thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me, Kris. So I serve as the executive director of the LGBT Center of Central PA here in Harrisburg. We're on 3rd Street right next to the Midtown Scholar bookstore. I am originally from Philly, have spent the last 11 years here in Harrisburg City, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation today.
I love it. And as I said to Amanda before, over the last couple of months, we've been having a lot of conversation around Black Lives Matter movement and what does it mean for us to be an inclusive church. And a shared mutual friend, Lana Zimmerman, is in a conversation on her back porch, is the one who inspired me to reach out to you. And I think she helped navigate this a little bit. And so glad that you are here. And it feels like you're a part of us, even through the extension of Lana and the entire Zimmerman. So tell us a little bit more around the work of the center and your particular work and its kind of role here in the Central Pennsylvania area.
Absolutely. So since 2006, our center has been serving Central Pennsylvania, based here in Harrisburg City, but our region covers Dauphin, Cumberland, York, and Lancaster counties. And our mission is to foster inclusive communities and holistic well-being for LGBTQ plus people, which we do through social, educational, and cultural engagement. And so what that looks like on a week-to-week basis is we have different groups for specific subsets of our communities. So a group for LGBTQ youth and young adults, a group for transgender and non-binary people, a group for LGBTQ older adults, and a group for queer and trans people of color, because we recognize that while there are a lot of shared experiences that we have, there are also specific needs that different parts of our communities have as well. And so those groups function on a weekly basis as a space for community connection and support. And we also do a lot of training and education out in the community. So not only being a space where people can come to us and find community, but also trying to go out into our communities and create more inclusive spaces. So at workplaces, at health systems in our area, schools and colleges, businesses, on how they can create more inclusive spaces as well. So that's really at the core of what we do at the center.
Yeah, that's great. And share with me or share with us. I appreciate it because it seemed like you have both just the relational aspect of in support and in community with, but also great community work with education and advocacy. But just tell me a little bit more around, and even for those in our church or those who may listen in the future, what is it like for an LGBTQ plus person to live in Harrisburg? And what are maybe the biggest challenges that kind of spur you on in the midst of your own work at the center?
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. And I think certainly in Harrisburg City, there are positives, like we have a local non-discrimination ordinance for the city of Harrisburg, which is actually the second oldest in the state. After Philadelphia. And there are certainly spaces like the center, spaces like some of the gay bars and other community spaces that are by and for queer and trans people. So those are certainly some of the positives, I think, of being queer or trans in Harrisburg, but also recognizing that LGBTQ people aren't a monolith either. So depending on kind of all of our intersecting identities, we have different experiences as well. Things like for queer and trans people of color, particularly transgender women of color, there is the danger of violence and harassment that is a national and global epidemic, but that also can happen here as well. for our youth, there are the realities of bullying in schools and rejection by families that at times leads to homelessness. For our young adults, especially, we see a lot of housing instability, and our older adults often deal with social isolation, as well as concerns about having to go back into the closet if they reach a point where they can no longer care for themselves at home. And so yeah, there are kind of common threads of our experiences, but then there are also these different realities that we face as well.
That's helpful, and I think it's cool to hear, at least in some ways, being queer in the city is a positive thing in some sense, right? And that the second oldest ordinance in the state, that's cool. That's something I didn't know in such a profound way, but also just the concern in general for LGBTQ siblings. So let me ask you this question, because in some ways, some who are listening may that this conversation may not be new to them, and they're so grateful that you're here. And for some, this conversation and the work of the center may be entirely new and a little uncertain. And so, let's have a little bit of conversation around, how should we in conversation be conscious in terms of language, to be respectful to our queer siblings, or in some ways, we have our pronouns on our screen right now, and let's just talk about that a little bit. And what are some kind of fundamental or foundational, maybe educational things that we can talk through, even in this moment, if someone is brand new and maybe part of our church, but would love to be in a community or would love to know more, and this is a chance for them to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it starts with recognizing that there's a whole spectrum of sexual orientation, so who you're attracted to, gender identities, so who you know yourself to be in terms of gender, and gender expression, so how you choose to express your gender externally to the world. And none of these are defined by the sex that we were assigned at birth. And so knowing that, which can be new for folks and can be kind of jarring at first, because we were taught about these strict binaries, right? Like you're only male or female, you're only gay or straight, and that there's really so much more to sexuality and gender than that. So it's kind of first recognizing that there are these whole spectrums of identity. And then second, it's critical to start unlearning the assumptions that we've been taught about these things, which show up in our language often without us even realizing it. So for example, a couple who is going to have a baby, and the first question you ask is it a boy or a girl, right? Or as a kid gets older, if it's a girl, people making jokes about, oh, she's going to break all the boys' hearts when she grows up. Or when you meet a new person and you're making assumptions about the gender of their partner, will your wife be joining us tonight? Or if you're greeting a group of people that you perceive to be women with, hello, ladies. Or if you're emceeing an event and you say, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Those language pieces that are so deeply embedded in how we talk to each other are often things that we don't even think about. But the messages that they convey is that first, gender is either or, right? Boy or girl. And it's based on biological sex and nothing else. And the assumption that we are coupled with or interested in or attracted to someone of a different gender and not our own gender. And that we can make assumptions about who people are based on what we can see externally in terms of gender. And so those are all the things that we have to start recognizing and breaking down in order to get to a place where we can reshape how we see gender and sexuality and how we use our language to reflect that. And so when we're talking about language, it's important to recognize when those assumptions come up and work to de-gender our language. So for example, ask the expectant parents, how is the baby doing? Because we really don't know what their gender will be until they get older and they're able to express that themselves. Not imposing a sexuality on kids or teenagers, but making sure they know there's a whole range of options for who they could be attracted to. Using gender neutral language is really important, about someone's partner if they haven't disclosed their gender. So defaulting to they, them rather than assuming he or she, or using language like partner or spouse instead of husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend. And using gender language neutral like hello everyone or greetings distinguished guests. There are lots of different options that oftentimes we don't even think about because we're so used to talking in a specific way that assumes gender and sexuality. But those are some of the ways that we need to start interrogating those assumptions and reshaping our language. And part of that is pronouns too, as you pointed out. You can see on the screen, both of us have identified our pronouns. And that's a really important piece to be more conscious of and inclusive to our transgender and non-binary folks. That being clear about what our pronouns are and creating space for others to identify themselves with their pronouns takes away the assumptions about who people are and the frequent misgendering. So assuming a pronoun that's not correct for someone else. Like if I looked at Kris and said, oh, she's going to talk with us today, she is not Kris's pronoun. But oftentimes we assume that and assume that based on what people look like, which really doesn't tell us anything about who they are. And so putting our pronouns on things like this, in Zoom, which many of us are on, if you rename yourself, you can include your pronouns, you can include it on your email signature, and just in conversation when you're introducing yourself. Like most of the time I start with, hi, my name is Amanda, I use she, her pronouns. And that the goal is that creates a space where the person I'm meeting feels comfortable in sharing their pronouns as well.
And I appreciate you sharing that because in some ways there's a level of, in unique way, like simplicity actually. And I just loved how you changed a little bit to say our natural tendency to say hello men and women or hello ladies and gentlemen, right? But there's a sense of like hello everyone is just as inviting. It's just as, and in some ways just as inclusive actually of it, truly being inclusive of everyone who is truly there. And I appreciated just how do we deconstruct how we understand and how our initial impressions or our assumptions about people, and which has a lot of power in that actually. When we have assumptions about someone, we're assuming a lot about them rather than first actually embodying a sense of learning and being open and listening to hear who someone is and how they identify and how they would like to be communicated with. Is that fair, Amanda?
Absolutely.
So I would love, and we're going to get to, for those who are listening, we're going to kind of walk toward what does it mean to be a queer person in the church, but I also want to kind of like also understand so some who are listening are supportive and believe in rights and for our queer brothers and sisters, but I would also love to hear if someone is not LGBTQ+, how can they tangibly support, love, and care our LGBTQ siblings?
Absolutely. That's a great idea. And I would say it starts with educating yourself. So there's tons of great resources out there, books and podcasts and articles, as well as trainings, which we offer through the center. And so I think as we need to go through this process of deconstructing our assumptions and learning new ways of being and speaking and interacting, they're taking advantage of those resources is a really important first step. That doesn't put the burden of teaching on maybe the one LGBTQ person that you know, right? That's not fair to expect that of them, but taking advantage of the resources that people have already put a lot of thought and effort into, as well as, if you're buying a book, you're tangibly supporting an LGBTQ author oftentimes. And secondly, and related, is listening. So whether that's listening to people in your life who are LGBTQ and really listening, not just listening to respond, right, but listening to understand and to ask curious questions and to try to understand their experiences and their point of view, as well as listening to people you may not know, again, through, books and podcasts and other resources. And in that process, being willing to sit with the discomfort that challenging your own assumptions and belief systems will bring, right? It's uncomfortable to be confronted with completely different ways of understanding the world or understanding gender and sexuality or the Bible than what you've believed your whole life, but not running away from that, and not becoming defensive, but sitting with that, and being willing to kind of dig in and do the work to better understand. And I think if you are at a place where you're wanting to, really visibly support LGBTQ people, then be visible about it. So whether it's at your workplace or your church or on social media, put up a rainbow flag, put up a pride sticker, share something on social media about LGBTQ inclusion. Because if you are aspiring to be an ally, but nobody knows that, then that doesn't really do LGBTQ people any good. And so being willing to be visible about your support is really important. And then in whatever spaces that you're in, whether it's in a church space or a workspace or your kid's school or your own school, working to create more inclusive spaces for LGBTQ people there, and being ready to intervene, to speak up, to show up when, whether on social media or in person, an LGBTQ people or an LGBTQ person is being harassed or undermined or in some way not safe, being willing to be actively engaged in those situations.
I appreciated the fullness of that comment, right? Or that fullness of the response. So it's not just educating, but it is that. It's not just listening, but it is that. But there's an action to that. And so visible being an ally, but also willing to stand up or to speak out in the midst of harassment or harm that can be done toward our siblings. And I just appreciate just kind of the nature of that. And let me just ask one more question around the center and you, and then we'll talk about faith and Bible and all of that fun stuff in a moment. But how have you and the center responded to this kind of global pandemic, but also even to the increased visibility of the Black Lives Matter movement? And has the center taken a response to that? I would love just to hear a little bit about that from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are kind of the two biggest things that are happening in the world right now. So in terms of the pandemic, so like many places, we've been operating virtually since mid-March. So still providing spaces for LGBTQ people to find that community and connection and support, which is even more important right now because of the pandemic, but doing that in a virtual space. So we do continue to offer all of our groups every week. And we've also kind of sought to adjust our programming to meet the new needs that are emerging because of the pandemic. So we've seen both the psychological and economic needs for LGBTQ people as a result of the pandemic. So psychological in terms of people's mental health, being stuck at home for many folks for months on end with limited social contact, particularly for our older adults as well as our youth who might not be in affirming spaces at home, and really trying to find creative ways to connect. So we send care packages to some of our youth as a way to, provide some fun items to them in a physical way, even though we can't be with them physically. And we've increased our Aging with Pride group from once a month to once a week to provide more connection for our older adults. And in terms of economic needs, we've seen obviously the loss of work and loss of income impact on our community as with other communities, and really seeking to share information in terms of how people can access benefits and services through some of the COVID relief legislation. And we also set up a mutual aid network on Slack specifically for our LGBTQ plus communities, recognizing that we have a long history of caring for each other. And so having that as a virtual space where people can post, hey, this is what I need, or this is what I can offer to help meet tangible needs, but also foster increased community in the process. In terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, so racial justice was already part of our vision, mission, and values as an organization, as well as our strategic plan. But kind of in this moment right now, we're seeking to do more to be actively supporting the movement. So we started with a strong statement of supporting Black Lives Matter, and follow that by some tangible actions. So some of us on staff, as well as board members, have been participating in protests. We handed out water at one of the marches that went right past the center. And right now we are trying to share information and resources for folks. So we have anti-racism book bundles, which are different sets of books, all by Black authors that people can purchase. We're partnering with Black-owned bookstores. So all of the money is going to the Black-owned bookstores. We're not profiting off of it, but we are offering people an option to make a donation at the end, which goes to GLOW, which is a center up the street from us. That's one of our programs, which is specifically for men who have sex with men of color and trans women of color, ages 14 to 29. So we're trying to provide educational access to books, supporting Black-owned businesses, and offering an opportunity for folks to support GLOW as well. And then we're also each month putting together a racial justice resource list around a different theme. So in June, it was focused on kind of what folks can do for specifically justice for Black people who had been killed by the police. So Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and kind of all of the names that we know. And then most recently, we put together a resource sheet around what does defunding and abolishing the police mean. So that has been so much at the forefront of what the national movement has been calling for. And while we don't have an organizational position on that as a center, we are committed to learning and engaging in those important conversations and making those resources available to our communities. And then finally, we're going to be holding a dismantling white supremacy for white people group that will hopefully be starting in the next month or so as a space to help white people do the work that we need to do in order to better be supporting the Black Lives Matter movement.
That's beautiful. And just thanks for, I didn't know that dismantling racism or that work was part of your mission already. And so thanks for just continuing to be a community leader in that. And I remember the march I was a part when we got water at the center. Like I remember, when you named that, I remembered getting water there on that watch. So thanks for just being engaged in that. And there's such an intersectionality in this work. And so it makes a lot of sense for you to be engaged. Now let's kind of dive in a little bit of a different direction for a moment. So like as a queer person and as a person of faith, Amanda, like what has been your experience with the church? That's a huge question. And so thanks for being willing to share a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, it's an important question. So a bit about my story. So I was raised Mennonite, and that has continued to be my faith tradition as an adult. So as a child and teenager in Philly, where I grew up, the church that I was in was not LGBTQ inclusive, but it also didn't preach like hellfire and brimstones. So there was mainly just silence about sexuality. So it never even occurred to me, as a kid or as a young adult or teenager, that I could be anything other than straight. Like that just wasn't an option because it wasn't talked about or modeled for me as I was growing up. And then as a college student and like a young 20-something in Harrisburg, the church I attended at that time did sometimes preach from the pulpit that being gay was a sin and that gay people were going to hell. I still wasn't out at that point, not even to myself, but I knew that it didn't feel right. And while that wasn't the belief of everyone there, the person preaching it was one of the loudest voices. And so that was one of the reasons that I left that church. And then the church I joined next in Harrisburg, I felt immediately connected to. It became my community, in many ways my family. And it was during that time that I came to understand my own identity as a queer person and started to come out to the people who were close to me, including some in my church family. And it was actually when I got this job at the LGBT Center and came out very publicly that things started to change. And while my pastor and my closest friends at that church always had my back, others in the church were not accepting. And it broke my heart to leave that faith community, but it got to a point where I couldn't stay any longer. And so I took about 2 years off from church after that because it was a really hurtful and traumatic experience, and I needed some time and some distance to heal from that. And then last year I started attending Community Mennonite Church of Lancaster, which was the first church I've ever been part of that was openly and unapologetically affirming of LGBTQ people. I hadn't realized how much I had missed having a faith community until I started attending CMCL, and being able to bring my whole self into that space and see other out queer people there has been part of my healing as well.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, a little bit of your story, and just I'm so grateful actually just that you found a community where you have been able to be your entire self, and that has been affirmed and celebrated, and so glad that's so, I'm so grateful to hear that, because I think on the contrary, so often there's been harm done by faithful Christians to the LGBTQ community. And so just share a little bit, and you shared a little bit about your own story and the harm that, and the difficulty that was for you, and the pain of that. But what would you say, maybe even on a larger scale, what is the harm that's been done, or what is the continual harm being done?
Absolutely. So when I first started working at the center, still kind of hurting from the rejection I had experienced, I was surprised at how often this topic came up, whether in groups at the center or just through informal conversation. And while everyone's experience is different, I discovered that there were some common threads, that so many queer and trans people that I encountered have had similar, or at times even worse, experiences in terms of being judged and rejected and shamed and pushed out of faith communities. And it made me incredibly sad to realize that, and also a little bit less alone, to kind of see that this was actually something bigger than my own experience, but it was something happening on a structural and systemic level, where church ideology and structures and practices, specifically within Christianity, have aligned with LGBTQ oppression for decades, and that's something that so many of us experience. And I think, I can only speak from my own experience. I think some of the most harmful things for me haven't been hearing that gay people were going to hell from the pulpit. The few people that I did hear that from were extremists, and it was kind of easy for me to disregard that because I wasn't close to them and they didn't represent the whole church. Sure. The most harmful things for me have been things that quote unquote faithful Christians have said that they thought they were saying out of love. So, hearing someone whose home I had been in many times in tears because she's afraid that her brother who's gay is going to hell. Hearing someone else who I had many conversations with, repeatedly talking about how we can love each other while not agreeing with certain choices or lifestyles. Those were the things that cut deep for me. And there were the unspoken things too. So having to wonder if people would still take communion from me, or if I was getting the cold shoulder because I was out now, or if parents felt less comfortable with me being around their children. I felt like I couldn't bring my whole self into the space or share about my life fully, and had to carefully calculate if speaking up was worth the emotional energy. And so it was traumatic, and it's something that I've healed from, but it still leaves scars. And I know that many other LGBTQ people have experienced far worse, from being subjected to conversion therapy, to being kicked out of their homes by parents who were rejecting their identity. 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, despite LGBTQ youth making up only 7% of the youth population. And the top reason for LGBTQ youth homelessness is parental rejection, which is too often driven by the weaponizing of religion.
I'm almost speechless right now, and but I need to ask a follow-up question, because I think my heart and my mind is hurting. It's just like, in light of that, what led you to come back to the church, Amanda? I think in some sense people leave. They're rejected, and for whatever reason that place represents harm, and and anything but love, and yet you return to the church?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I wasn't always sure that I would, but for me, church hasn't just been a place of rejection or pain. There's also been so much love and community in all of the churches that I've been a part of. Each of them has shaped me in so many important ways, and the relationships that I have from each of them, are part of who I am. And so church for me is so much about community and finding family and home and a space to be who you are. And even though, the first 3 churches I was part of, I couldn't fully find that, there are still so many things that I valued about those spaces and about that community. And so ultimately I missed that community. I missed having a group of people with a shared faith seeking to love and serve others. And that's what brought me back.
Wow. Thanks for coming back. And I just appreciate you sharing honestly about that. And in some ways, I think it's helpful for me to hear as the lead pastor of the journey, but for others who will hear just the potential, or just not the potential, the reality that harm is done at times by institutional church. Mm-hmm. And those experiences leave like lasting scars. Mm-hmm. And yet, like, we know like that religion, or particularly Christianity, has the profound nature to be deeply loving, deeply mm-hmm. supporting, deeply caring in such a beautiful way that at times we lose our witness in that. And even as a Methodist, one of our core principles is like to do no harm. Mm-hmm. And yet at times our denomination does harm, even though we value not doing harm, and the contradiction in that. And so I just would love to hear a little bit around what are LGBTQ persons looking for in a church or faith community? And yeah, I'll at least answer that first, and that'll be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So just speaking from my own experience, when I was looking for a church last year, kind of ready to try again, I was looking for some place where I could feel safe as a queer person of faith, where I could bring my whole self and not have to hide or downplay my queerness. So this meant looking for really clear and unapologetic statements from churches that they were LGBTQ inclusive, and seeing other LGBTQ people represented there. So the main reason I chose CMCL was because of that. On their website, in their mission statement, on their bulletin, in their lobby, everywhere you looked, you could not miss the fact that they were LGBTQ inclusive. And I saw other queer people there and represented. And I heard LGBTQ inclusion addressed in sermons and in services, and kind of all of those things helped me feel safe. And I think that's what a lot of LGBTQ people are looking for, the things that make us feel safe in those spaces.
Yeah, and I appreciate you just kind of naming what does that safe look like. Mm-hmm. And that is like statements that's seeing other LGBTQ persons around, that's language in sermons. I just think that's really helpful just for you to name. And so let's just tackle, this is probably a huge question, and you probably know where I'm going. I just would love to hear, even just briefly, like knowing that I could spend an entire month unpacking, but how do you navigate the Bible? I just want to ask. I respect you so much, and I've enjoyed this conversation, and think you have much wisdom to share with me and in our community. I would love just to hear how you respond to that.
Absolutely. So for me, growing up, I learned that being gay was a sin. It wasn't emphasized a lot, but it was still kind of there as part of what I was taught about the Bible. And while I didn't believe it with a passion, I also never really questioned it. So it wasn't until college, when a group called Equality Ride came to my small kind of conservative Christian college campus, that I first heard both the stories of gay Christians for the first time, and was given some resources for how to understand a different way of reading the Bible when it came to sexuality. And so a small booklet that they passed out called What the Bible Says and Doesn't Say About Homosexuality, written by Reverend Mel White, was what really introduced me to a new way of understanding, what we call those clobber passages, right? That are so often used against LGBTQ people. And so kind of getting that booklet, reading it, and at the same time hearing from other gay Christian students from other college campuses talking about their own stories was really powerful for me in helping me to kind of see that there were other options, that, what I had been taught growing up was not the only way that people were thinking about sexuality in the church. And so having those options, I was then able to come to my own decisions about what I believed, not just taking on what I had been taught. And since then, I've continued to read, to learn, to better understand the nuances and context of these passages, as well as other passages that are too often just simplistically leveraged to support pre-existing ideas and worldviews. One of the many things that I've learned from Tom Longenecker is that we must continue to do the work to understand the cultural context of the Bible. What was it saying to the people it was written to in that time and place, and how did they understand it? And then really carefully apply those lessons to today in our very different cultural context, and knowing that our own worldviews, our own identities influence everything about how we read the Bible and understand it. So rather than looking to the Bible to reinforce what we already know to be true, really looking at it to see what can I learn about this story of God and what was being communicated to the people that it was being written to.
Amen. Thanks for answering that question. And beautiful, I think, beautiful response. And kind of two final questions for you. And then whomever is listening, if you have a question for Amanda or any affirmation, feel free at any point to ask a question, and then we'll see what happens. But kind of the last two questions. What's one thing that you wish to share with what we call kind of faithful Christians who may not know what they think about full inclusion, but what would be one thing you want to share with faithful Christians?
Yeah, so I think churches often talk about LGBTQ inclusion on this intellectual and theological level, right? But I think what I need people to understand is that this issue, as people often call it, is not something that's abstract or theological or theoretical. You're talking about real people with real identities, feelings, lived experiences. You're talking about me, and you're also talking about the kid in your congregation who's too afraid to come out. And when conversations on LGBTQ inclusion are framed as these two sides with equally valid points, the problem is these two sides are not equal. So if your conviction is predicated on the rejection of my humanity, we're not on equal footing. And if your interpretation of the Bible reinforces the oppression that I and so many LGBTQ people experience daily, then you are complicit. And so it comes down to a choice, right? Are you willing to love the person in front of you with no strings attached, and be willing to, as a result, question and change some of the deeply held beliefs that you have? Or will you continue to hold tightly to what you have always believed and leave that person out in the cold? Because when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion, you can't do both. So you have to make a choice. And I remember a story that David Simmons told in a sermon once, which was right before I came out. He talked about an older gay patient he had met as a chaplain, and the deep wounds that he carried with him, the patient, until his dying day from not being accepted by the church. And David's question to us was, how often do people have to go around the church to find Jesus?
Wow.
And I think that's a question that the church needs to continue to wrestle with.
What I so much appreciate on this conversation, Amanda, is one, just you sharing your honest perspective and your own story as as difficult but as beautiful as it has been for you, but also just how you have, I think, spoken life and perspective into our own church at the Journey, right? So we are new and been around for a year, and we're still in this beautiful season around like truly forming who we believe God's calling us to be, and wanting to make sure we're clear about that. And I think your perspective, I think, just speaks volumes, and to how can we really, as a church, be clear and to use your language, to love unapologetically and or love without strings attached. And how can people find Jesus in us or in the church, and they don't have to go around the church, which I think is just very haunting as a professional pastor. So thank you. And I just want to ask one final question. It's a question I ask all of my guests on Expert Opinion, and maybe you'll say the same thing. And if it's just a rehashing of the same thing, that's beautiful as well. But I would love to know what's one thing you hope that we learn as a society, as a people, because of all that's been happening in the world, from COVID to BLM, even to our conversation around inclusion. What's one thing that you hope that we learn because of it all?
That's a great question. I hope that we can learn and continue to learn that we are responsible for one another. Wow. That, amidst this pandemic that none of us saw coming, that healthy people are responsible for taking all the precautions so that people who are more at risk can live, right? White people are responsible for doing as much as we possibly can to actively engage in the Black Lives Movement so that Black people can live and thrive, right? Straight people who are not LGBTQ are responsible for having these difficult conversations, for learning, for listening, for making hard choices so that we can be a full part of community, and that we can have our humanity fully recognized and embraced. And so that's something that I hope we can all learn through this, and continue to learn how to act out in real ways.
Wow. Thank you. And the comments alone, I think, will show how appreciative people are with you sharing the story in our dialogue today. And I hope that we continue to learn from you, Amanda, and that the center continually can educate and inform us as a church and as leadership, or just simply as people, even outside of our faith, just as fellow humans on this shared journey of life, that how can we love without strings attached, and to love people for who we would believe are people of sacred worth and of value, and are created intimately by God. So thanks for speaking into our community tonight. Any final words before we head out?
No, just thank you for the space, for having these conversations, and for the work that you're doing. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And friends, thanks for tuning in tonight. We'll gather for 2 more weeks until the first season of Expert Opinion comes to an end. But thank you all. And I guess in light of Amanda's challenge, may we love without strings attached all of our fellow siblings. And so blessings to you, my friends, and thank you again, Amanda.
Thank you.